During our second season of Back to Work, our goal was to find leaders to discuss trending topics in the staffing industry space. A lot has changed over the past few years, and we want to know what the mood is across the industry, not just at Yelp. Joining us for this two-part question and answer series for Back to Work is our guest, Barry Asin, President at Staffing Industry Analysts. Barry's specialties include research, business strategy, competitive and industry analysis. He's an expert in workforce trends and developments, and the development of contingent and alternative work arrangements. Barry, welcome to the podcast.
Joe, thank you. Great to be here. I really appreciate you guys having me.
Awesome. Now, over this two-part series, Barry's going to provide us with some insight into the gig economy and the human cloud, staffing industry trends, the intersection of talent and technology, competitive landscapes, and much more. I know that sounds like a lot, but Barry, let's dig in.
Let's do it.
In a 2018 gig economy summary, Staffing Industry Analysts, SIA, said that, quote, the gig economy continues to disrupt, enhance, and transform traditional work models, methods, means, and infrastructures. As organizations around the world utilize, explore, and reconfigure contingent work across marketplaces, there is an increasing spotlight on the human cloud, the fastest growing segment of today's technology-fueled gig economy. Now, first, Barry, can you explain to listeners, maybe those who aren't exactly sure, what is the human cloud and the gig economy?
Right. So there, I think there's a lot of terminology, and every field has that, and I think our terminology has evolved a lot. Really, what we're talking about is how technology is changing. As far as the term human cloud, we don't really even use that so much anymore. We talk much more about what we call talent platforms and staffing platforms, and the idea is how technology is connecting the work that needs to be done with the workers. And so that's really just a way of thinking for those people who are sort of tech minded, of thinking of all, you can get software and service in a cloud. You can also tap into talent through technology. And so there's a whole segment of firms that are out there that can help you find talent through sort of tech platforms, and that's what a lot of that is. That's one thing about connecting with work and workers. The gig economy, we refer to that as sort of the same thing. You may have heard the term contingent work, and the idea, or temporary work. The whole thing there is that there's a whole lot of people, somewhere depending on how you measure it, between 20 to 40% or so of the workforce of people who are working on short-term assignments. It's not I never refer to permanent work because no job is permanent, particularly in the world today. But traditional work, and then there's all sorts of people who are doing short-term work, and sort of that's where the term gig came from. But this has been around for a long time. There've been temporary workers, there's freelancers, independent contractors, consultants, and a lot of companies, hire what we would call gig workers as well, or like summer interns and seasonal help. So there's a whole part of the economy around that, and it's been a growing trend. It's a great way for organizations to get the talent that they need for just the work that they need getting done. And Joe, that's probably more than you wanted to know, but
no, that's perfect. I mean, I think a lot of people are aware of the gig economy, and there's certainly positives and negatives for both the employer and the employee. How do you think, or how has the gig economy shifted, if at all, over the past 2+ years since COVID?
Yeah, well, it's been I think the big thing that's happened is that it's been a eye-opening moment for people about flexibility. If anything came out of COVID, one big thing was like, work did not have to get done. We all operated, and I mean, we've had this giant social experiment, and we've seen that, like, for a lot of people, particularly in knowledge work, I mean, you and I are sort of, working remotely here right now as we're talking. And so we've had this big experiment about remote work. We've had this big experiment about flexible work. because talent, and we'll probably touch on this a little bit later. We've also seen, you know, much more. We're today much more in a situation where the workers' talent is in the driver's seat, and that the dynamics have shifted with employers. And so employers, if people want to work on a flexible basis, um, that I think that more and more employers are open to that. So like never before, it's like a light switch flipped, and suddenly it's like, no, 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 you must be in the office, you must work 40 hours a week, you must be a full-time employee. And suddenly if it's like, oh, if you want to work across the country and you want to work, certain hours, or you want to be working on a sort of freelance or a temp basis or something, fine. And so I think there's much more interest in that, from much more willingness to look at these sorts of options. And, workers their lives have sort of opened up as well. So not only are employers saying, yeah, we're more open to that, workers are going, like, I just, it wasn't that great, the old world of work. And let's stop with the hour and a half commute each way. Let's stop with the sort of job. I mean, all these people that decided the jobs they had weren't fulfilling for them. So there's been a lot of change. I think that's part of why, people feel so unsettled right now in a lot of ways, is just the world is changing, and we'll all get used to it. And I think, I mean, people are so incredibly adaptable. I mean, really, it happened in, pretty fast, right? In a couple of months there, suddenly all these new ways of working sort of appeared.
Yeah, I think if you told probably the majority of workers back in March 2020 that it could be 2.5 years and many of us would still not have gone back in the office or not be back in the office 5 days a week, it would be a big shock. So,
It certainly was at the time, right?
yeah,
It was like the impossible that could never happen, that suddenly was, went to inevitable or likely, and then it was just obvious. And now we all look back and go, well, I wonder why. Now, of course, there's still this ongoing debate of like, what's the right way to do that, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit.
yeah. Speaking of that, I mean, over the past few months, it's now September 2022, almost October. Some companies, especially in Philadelphia, Comcast is starting to welcome back people in the office, and I think more and more companies are generally. What might happen in your eyes if organizations kind of force everybody back to work? What are the risks there? And if they don't support anymore that flexible work style,
Yeah.
what are some of those biggest risks?
Well, the biggest risk right now is that unemployment is at near record lows, 3.5%, something like that. We first time unemployment claims every month are at record low levels as well. So we're in this very odd point because, there's certainly warning signs out there flashing recession, but there are something like 2.5 times the number of open jobs for the number of unemployed people. So the obvious thing is, people have choices. And so the risk for an organization is that you won't get the talent that you need, that people will say, okay, I'm going to change the channel, and I'm going to go find somebody who will do it. One of the exciting things for companies that are willing to embrace flexible work is your labor market just opened up. And so if you're in an area where, particularly outside of urban centers, if you're in an area where the workforce is pretty constrained, and the skill level of the people there, as there's a very fixed pool, suddenly now you've got a regional, national, depending on the work, sometimes global labor pool to pull from. And so if you're willing to embrace that, it's a huge opportunity. But certainly for those, I mean, I do think some companies, depending on what the work is and what their particular market situation is, they might be able to just insist on everybody back in the office. And then if you don't like it, get out. And maybe if the economy turns around, in a very dramatic way here, we'll get to a point where people will be willing to get back in the car and drive a couple hours. But my guess is, um, we're never going back. And the data we have shows that the expectation for most companies and most workers is it's not going to be as much remote as it was in the middle of 2020 when people were worried, that they were going to get COVID and die. They're, obviously that's still happening tragically, but the risk is much less now. So I think for the vast majority of people, we're going to end up in this hybrid world where a couple of days a week or one day a week or one day a month or some version of time people will get together in person, but it's going to be very intentional. Like, why are we getting together in person, and like what are we doing? And we're not just going to go in and into the office and just hang out and work on our own. I think people want to know what the point of it is.
Yeah, what have you seen, I guess, from either employers and also employees as to, what their maybe future plans are and what employees are looking for? Certainly, there is a missing element of culture. I would assume when people are all working remotely that we don't have anymore. But there's so many benefits to it too. So, what are you seeing as, how do
Yeah.
we structure that?
Well, I think, from the employer side, um, I talk to a lot of CEOs and top executives about, particularly in staffing and recruiting firms, and they're thinking about their own internal organization as well as their clients. They are very worried about, like, remote work works great for people who have been around a while and have done the job and have established relationships. And if you're and there is a way to build culture, and you have to have more intentional meetings, and just best be more intentional about it because there's less just sort of random bumping into people. But they are worried about people who are new to the workforce, younger workers, and are they going to get the sort of learning by osmosis? So I think that's from the company side. And so I think for many of them, with their more junior employees, they are pushing them back into the office. And the fact of the matter is, typically the younger folks more likely to want to be back in the office. Particularly if they don't have the challenges that parents have. And once you get to the point where you've got kids at home and soccer practice to drive to and all that sort of stuff, it gets there are a lot of benefits to working from home. So, I'm not sure I've totally answered your question here, Joe, but I think that it's, we're in this sort of period of renegotiating really the terms of this, and I think that the concerns are about culture, relationships, learning. But the benefits are like, there's a lot of benefits. There's productivity benefits, and if you hire the right people. There's always risks if you hire the wrong people, that they're just going to be checked out and unsupervised, which I guess is, people worry about that as well.
Yeah, it seems like there's still obviously so much uncertainty, even 2.5 years into this, but now it's more uncertainty about what is the right decision to make. Companies aren't just uncertain about what the future looks like, but it's about, what is the right decision for our business type and what's the right decision for our current employees, our future employees. It's not easy to make, and you're the one talking to so many CEOs. Is it a
I've
matter of
seen I've
just,
seen I've seen everything. So I've
yeah,
seen the ones who are like, no, 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 we are in the office 5 days a week. And of course, then it means, your labor pool is, people within driving distance of the office. If you can get the talent you need, then I think that works. Then I've also seen companies that have tried that and, discovered that people had moved. They'd left the state. Certainly, I'm out in California. We've seen, lots of people moving to places where housing costs are lower and the like. So, and everything in between to the hybrid. So I think the experiment is still ongoing. I don't think there is any one right answer, but there is, if there's anything, like I said before, I think there is it's just we're going to be more intentional about why are, you're not just in the office just because that's what you do. Like you show up and, in the office area, it's more like, what are you there for? Is it a learning? Is it networking? Is it a culture? Is it team building? Is it, is it just sort of teamwork and collaboration? All sorts of things. But I think less of the individual work heads down stuff in an open office is unlikely to be the future, I guess. And the data we've got sort of shows that whereas at early in the pandemic, at least for knowledge workers, 80 or 90% were working remotely, it's come down, but it's not going to go back to the 5 or 10% that it was. We're going to end up somewhere in the middle, and for many more, it's going to be that hybrid sort of option.
Now, let's keep talking about the outlook of talent a little bit, but shift away from COVID. Obviously, the methods that employers use to recruit, retain top talent, they've changed dramatically over the past few years, and they're probably still changing daily. Um, Besides, the work environment is under siege, and many times by economic changes, with inflation changing people's outlooks there. Let's talk about just talent in general and how companies acquire and attract top talent. I'm sure you've seen so many staffing trends, you guys at SIA,
Yeah,
and you research every day. What are some of the changes in hiring, not just as a result of COVID, but the roles maybe people are looking for?
there's long-term trends and there's short-term trends. I think that as just as far as recruiting, I sort of alluded to this before. I think this idea of the power dynamics changing between workers and hiring managers and hiring companies. So that they're just given that we've gone to this point of like what I like to refer to as not just a talent shortage anymore. It's a crisis. Like there are crazy things going on out in the labor force right now. We do a lot on nurse staffing, and we have a whole event around the healthcare staffing industry, and that might be one of the more extreme examples. But we've seen nurses have like if they've been willing to take more flexible assignments, we've seen their pay double or more than double. And there's all sorts of reasons going on there. In particular, the burnout and just think about how nurses sort of went from being heroes to overworked and like this is never going to end sort of moment. And so, reassessing their lives. So I think we just we can't like, say enough about how this dynamic has changed between work and workers, particularly for skilled workers. There is that it, but even for lower skilled workers, it's we've seen similar sorts of things, maybe just a little bit less dramatic. So I think big trend is talent being in the driver's seat and this sort of talent crisis. I guess the other big change is just around technology and in the way that companies connect with workers. There's been huge investment in HR and hiring technology over really over the last decade. And I would say that, that whole process was very cumbersome. And if you just think about like how you'd normally go about hiring someone, I mean, I can remember back to, how long it took when you put ads in the newspaper and you get your stuff in the mail and you'd sort through the resumes and then you'd sort of pull out that and you'd invite people in for maybe a phone interview and then an in-person interview, and that's all gotten speeded up by technology. I mean, simple things like Zoom or Teams or whatever the video platforms are, but also over the years, right, we've gone through the job boards and the growth of the sorts of nowadays like Indeed and LinkedIn and Monster and all these all these other different niche platforms to advertise on. But it's gone way beyond that. It's gotten much more sophisticated, much more tech driven. Companies that are really good at hiring are investing a lot of that, particularly the large companies. Um, but for the small and mid-sized companies, they've got a lot more options out there, and there's platforms and marketplaces for talent depending on the talent that they're looking for. So, you know, based on what you're looking for, I think that there's all sorts of options for where to go. And similarly for candidates, people who are out looking for jobs, there's lots more ways to connect with hiring managers. Social media has become a huge influence on this. Um, and I mean, we even see now like companies advertising on TikTok and all sorts of you get all these um, new ways of reaching people. And it's all about it in terms of hiring. It's about reaching people where they are. So in some ways, it's just an advertising and marketing. But then there's the whole process of connecting with those workers. We're starting to see like artificial intelligence and much more trying to figure out which jobs might appeal to who, and which candidates might be a good fit, and even AI driven matching processes to sort of shortlist and things like that. And so I think that's much more of the trend that we're going to see in the way that hiring happens. Certainly how it's changed over the last couple of years. And then I guess the final thing would just be, we've sort of touched on it, but this whole thing about flexibility. And so it's not just traditional standard employees that are, more and more, I think there's, that is a big trend. It's like you can get workers to connect with you. And that was happening pre-pandemic, but the pandemic just really put some gas on the fire there.
Yeah, I want to touch back on one thing about AI. What have been, I guess, the most prominent successes that you've heard of or seen with AI technology when it comes to recruiting, and what are some of the drawbacks of it? Certainly, when it comes to candidate matching, it seems like it's been super successful in many ways. But when it comes to the scheduling of interviews and that process of getting someone nailed down for an interview and then bringing them in for a secondary interview or getting them hired, there could be some complications there. So what are some of the pros and cons you've seen and heard about so far?
Yeah. Well, I think there's all sorts of things. So just like Netflix uses AI to suggest which movies you might like. I think that in the matching side, AI can do a great job of suggesting people who might be successful or jobs to people that they might be interested in that they wouldn't have thought of otherwise. The risks are obviously the flip side of that. This is not like movies, and to the extent that the AI got trained by that it's sort of reinforcing bias, gender bias, racial
Mhm.
bias, thing else like that. I think that is a risk, and so there's companies have been, I think, are being cautious about how they employ that around that, as well they should, to make sure that it's not sort of reinforcing discrimination. Um, so that's sort of the risk. I'll give you like an example of a success is we've gone to remote interviews, for instance. So this whole just like remote work happened, people suddenly woke up one day and realized like, gee, I don't really need to actually see, for many jobs, I don't need to meet them in person. Like we could do this over Zoom or over some other platform. There's been a whole growth of interviewing platform as a category of technology, and many of those use artificial intelligence, like particularly for people who are hiring programmers and things that have got very defined skills. You can have tests that are automated for people. Let's take a programmer to go through and actually prove that they know how to code. And the AI can do things like, identifying if they're exhibiting behaviors that would indicate they're cheating, or they're not the person they said they were. There's all this sort of crazy stuff that's gone on with remote hiring where like you interviewed one person and then somebody else showed up for work, and so AI is, it's being used in things like that to to just sort of provide greater assurance. I think that it's also speeding up a lot of processes, and it's really, it's just getting started in a lot of ways.
Well, Barry, we covered a lot already in about 30 minutes. Would you be able to stay on for just a little bit longer and cover a few more topics?
I'd be happy to, Joe.
Great. For our listeners, make sure you tune into part 2 of our conversation with Barry here. If you want to listen to future podcasts, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen in. For Yo's Back to Work, I'm Joe McIntyre. Thanks for listening.